What's up, guys? Today I want to talk about the current state of the Middle East, especially with regards to petrostates and the very low cost of a barrel of oil that we have today, and the ramifications for that, the consequences that that's going to have on politics, demographics, etc. This is all based on a summary of the Economist article, Twilight of an Era. It's from the July 18th edition of the Economist. So I want to give credit to where credit is due. So right now, oil is around $40 a barrel, and no petrostate can balance its budget with oil at that low of a level. So a petrostate is a primarily oil-producing country where a huge amount of its revenue comes from oil. Now, there are countries like Syria or Turkey where a very small amount of their income comes from natural gas, oil, or other fossil fuels. But we're talking about petrostates like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, etc., where the vast majority of their exports are fossil fuels. And they rely predominantly on high levels of oil, or high prices for oil to make their money. And they have come to rely a little too heavily, probably a lot too heavily, on oil to fund their state operations and their government. So during the 2000s, when America invaded the Middle East, you had sky-high oil prices over $90 or $100 a barrel for years on end, and a lot of governments got used to this. So Venezuela is another great example. Venezuela being a huge oil-producing nation, which now, because oil is lower than $70 a barrel and has been for a while, they've seen a massive economic crisis, and that compounds a lot of really bad governance. So what we see today is, because of the coronavirus pandemic, the idea that Middle Eastern oil-producing nations would have to scale back their reliance on petroleum to fund themselves. They had this idea that they could slowly wean themselves off oil before 2030, given that the world is going towards a more balanced energy portfolio, where people or countries are getting more and more of their energy from renewables, especially as global warming, climate change heats up. So that timeline of 2030 has been pulled up dramatically because people are traveling far less than they were. There are fewer boats going across the ocean. There are far fewer plane trips being taken. People are driving much less frequently. So oil has seen its price plummet. And if you were paying attention a few months ago, the price of oil was negative, that there just wasn't enough room to store oil. So what this means is that no country on the planet, no oil-producing country can balance its budget with the current price of oil. And it's going to take a very long time for the oil price to rebound to where it needs to be for these countries' governments to be able to finance their operations. Kuwait, where we invaded for the first Gulf War, major oil-producing nation, it might see a 40% deficit this year. Now, it's important to note the difference between deficit and debt. For those who don't know, deficit is the difference between your budget, how much you are planning to spend, and how much you are able to pay. So their income stream is down 40% from what they were expecting. And much of the Middle East has large sovereign wealth funds and cash reserves that they can tap. Sovereign wealth funds are when governments have extra money and they put them into large portfolios that they then invest. Norway has the largest in the world. Norway is another large petrostate, although very different from the Arab and Middle Eastern ones. But these countries are now relying on these sovereign wealth funds and also their cash reserves, just fat bank accounts, to fund their daily operations, which is not where they want to be, right? These are rainy day funds, yes. So they do have this money for situations like this, but with the price of oil so low and with it not going to rebound anytime soon, if ever, to the place where they need it. These cash reserves are going to be used up very quickly. So, one of the biggest problems that these countries are going to face are these demographic issues, the issues of the population. So, because these countries are so wealthy for such small populations, I believe Saudi Arabia has a population of 30 million, and its oil revenue is astronomical, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. I was just looking at Bahrain, which is one of the richest countries per capita. It's got 1.5 million people in an oil-rich country. So the economy completely revolves around oil and the production of it. And what this means is that the government can basically look at the economy, and if the economy is not doing a great job of employing people, the government can just pay people to stay home. So Saudi Arabia for the past decade has had about a 28% unemployment rate for young people. So people are going to college or not, but they're not able to find jobs. And they're basically just getting paid by the state, or their relatives are rich enough to fund their lifestyles. And this is how Saudi Arabia keeps their people content, is just throwing money at the problem. Every Saudi Arabian citizen basically gets to be middle class because of the oil wealth. And already Saudi Arabia, which is a country I'm probably going to be focusing on, Saudi Arabia has already spent a huge amount of its cash on the war in Yemen. A few years ago, the Saudi Arabian crown prince, who's essentially the ruler of Saudi Arabia now, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, decided to go to war in Yemen to partially shore up his popularity at home, prove himself to be a badass military guy, whatever. It's a disaster, right? I think everyone has seen that going to war in the Middle East is not a great idea, especially in this modern age when the population of countries can so easily be swayed by ideology to fight against any invader. So whether this is nationalism of saying you're invading my country, whether this is religion of, we have, say, Sunni or Shia invaders, and I'm not part of that religious class, I'm going to fight against them. There is every reason in the world that you're going to see guerrilla fighting, as we have seen in Yemen, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, everywhere. And it's such a slog to try to conquer any country. And so Saudi Arabia has just gotten bogged down in Yemen, spending hundreds of billions of dollars on that war for basically no gain. And Yemen is I'm pretty sure it's the poorest country in the Middle East. It has the same population as Saudi Arabia. It's right next door. So it's 30 million people in Saudi Arabia, 30 million people in Yemen. In Yemen, you have famines, you have droughts, you have overcrowding. In Saudi Arabia, everyone's pretty well off, as I was saying. So they've really been poking the hornet's nest right next door to them. And I wouldn't be shocked if Yemen started to, Yemeni fighters, especially the Houthi rebels who are fighting against the Saudi-led coalition, start to invade Saudi Arabia and bring the war to the Saudis, because they are next door neighbors. Anyway, so these underlying all this is this weak economy and these really scary demographics where you have a lot of young people with little to do, a war going on, multiple wars going on, right? You have a war in Libya, you have a war in Syria that's kind of wrapping up. And then Saudi Arabia is trying to cope with this through taxing the poor. They've raised their sales tax, which means everyone who's trying to buy something is going to start spending way more money, which is causing a huge amount of domestic turmoil and anger at MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, because they're paying for the government shortfall, even though the government is very wealthy, and because the government is run by the House of Saud. This is where Saudi Arabia gets its name. The House of Saud is the ruling family, and they're all millionaires, if not billionaires. The very top echelons are all billionaires. They're incredibly wealthy. And so the average Saudi Arabians are like, why are we paying 3 times the tax on all of these basic goods like toilet paper that we need when MBS is running around in his $550 million yacht? And the potential for domestic turmoil in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East in general is ever increasing. People are becoming poorer. There is festering conflict and war. There's the proliferation of weapons everywhere. And the government, the social contract that the government has with its citizens, where it says we will provide you with a good standard of living, especially to where you were 50 years ago, that's falling. That's coming apart. One last thing that the Saudis were kind of counting on is the Hajj, and the Hajj is an annual pilgrimage to Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, that every Muslim is expected to go on at least once in their life. Last year, 2.6 million pilgrims went on the Hajj. And this year, they're expecting 1,000. And the Hajj is a huge form of revenue. These pilgrims come, they stay for a while, they stay in Saudi Arabian hotels, spending lots of money. And so Saudi Arabia really doesn't have an economy that relies on its citizens being productive. It's oil and the fact that they are the caretakers of the holiest sites in Islam. So that's completely devastated by the coronavirus. Then we have the non-petro states like Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. These are the older, more established Middle Eastern countries. They have long histories of being centers of commerce, of finance, of culture and academics. And it's this weird reversal where in the past 50 or so years, oil has made Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, etc. Oil has made these countries very wealthy, with tons of money. And the previously rich and powerful regional nations like Egypt and Jordan, they've kind of taken a back seat, and they have very large populations, much larger than any petrostate, and they are not nearly as wealthy. So we have this interregional trade ecosystem where these non-petrostate countries have larger populations, they're better educated, they are relatively large manufacturing countries for the region at least. And they rely on the money from the petrostates to fund this, to take up any extra workforce, right? So 3% of Egyptians, 9% of Palestinians work in the petrostates. They migrate there to work. A stunning fact I read in this article is that 35,000 Lebanese citizens graduate from university every year, but the Lebanese economy can only employ 5,000 of them, which means we have 30,000 extra university graduates who either need to find a job in Lebanon that does not require a university degree, which creates, as you can imagine, a lot of resentment in the population, or they leave. And Egyptian doctors often go to petrostates where they can make a regular white-collar wage for, regular in American terms of tens, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, whereas if they stay in Egypt, they make a couple $100 a month, which is devastating, and that's one of the reasons that Egypt is having such a difficult time with the coronavirus right now. In addition, a large proportion of exports from Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon go to these petrostates. 21% of Egyptian exports, 32% of Jordanian, 38% of Lebanese exports all go to these petrostates, which are much smaller in population, but much larger in terms of disposable cash incomes. And these places also send a lot of tourists to these non-petrostates, these non-petrostate nations. Europeans go to Egypt a lot to see the pyramids, whatever, but they don't stay that long, and it's very quick. You take pictures of pyramids, you go to Karnak or whatever, and then you leave. Whereas the the Omanis, they come to Egypt. They can speak the language. They stay for a long time. They're spending lots of money. It's much more immersive. And then the last thing I want you to think about. So you have this really unequal balance, but it is all an interconnected network. These people all speak Arabic, although they are different dialects of Arabic. They're easily able to travel. But there's also pretty high standard of living. My audience, I'm assuming, is going to be mostly Western, if I have an audience. And maybe you think of the Middle East as backwards, but it's really not, right? People have access to the internet, to higher education, to learning. They have 1,000-year-old civilization. These are robust nations that really think of themselves very highly, and yet there's also so much war and devastation in the neighborhood. So Lebanon, a place where many people can expect to go to college, to get a white-collar job, working in a bank, working in a school, working in a hospital, they are right next door to the Syrian civil war. And I want my American colleagues to think about what if the state next door, say Minnesota, had a governor who was, and maybe this hits a little too close to home, but a governor who was waging war on their own citizens, locking them up in dungeons, shooting them in the street, bringing the military onto the streets, locking them in dungeons where they're tortured. This is very scary, and so the Lebanese citizenry who are right now in the midst of a complete economic meltdown, they realize it's very close to home that there are tyrants, there are despots, there are horrible military situations and civil wars right next door to them, and that's a very real fact of life. America, which used to be the kind of guarantor or safeguard of the region, and since Jimmy Carter in 1976 has declared that it will keep the peace to make sure that oil continues to flow. And of course, then we go in and invade and actually muck up everything and screw up the peace. But there has been this idea that America will stop interstate conflict to make sure that oil continues to make its way to American shores. In September, Iran attacked Saudi Arabian oil facilities, and America basically did nothing. And I think this it was a lot. It was like 40% of Saudi Arabian oil refining capacity. It put that offline. It was a huge blow, and we didn't do anything. So America has essentially, while America has really screwed up the region through its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan especially, but also it's meddling with Libya, with Lebanon, it's meddling with Iran, basically every single country. While we've really screwed things up, we have done a lot to put a damper on interstate conflict. But what we're seeing is that by pulling back, we're almost inviting Chinese and Russian influence, as well as Turkey is now playing a larger role. So Turkey borders Syria. It's begun or it has for a long time, been sending fighters to secure its border with Syria, and also send them into Syria itself to make sure that Turkish interests are protected. But Turkey is now sending soldiers to fight in Libya. And now this is becoming a proxy war, which is a proxy war is where two larger nations pick a battlefield far away from them. Think Vietnam between America and the Soviet Union. This proxy war in Libya is being exacerbated by Turkish and Russian meddling. Both countries are sending in mercenaries, sending in money and military material. So these wars oftentimes will bleed over, right? The ISIS fighters who started in Syria or in Libya are now fighting in Mali and West Africa, or they're making their way to Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan. So they train in one area and they're able to find their ways all across the region, indeed the world. And so this is going to have a major destabilizing effect on the region, worse than we already have. So just to wrap everything up, we have plummeting oil revenue, which makes governments much less capable of providing their citizens with basic necessities. Imagine the DMV or road repair or your water or imports, right? The Middle East is a place that imports a huge amount of material, a lot of food, but also just like it doesn't manufacture that much, so it's importing a huge amount. And with plummeting revenue, it's going to become harder and harder to get just even basic necessities, to say nothing of TVs or luxury goods. That this also means that government legitimacy is crumbling. So if the government can't provide the bare necessities, then there's a much greater chance that populations are going to come out onto the streets to protest and potentially fight their government. Remember, it was only 8 years ago that the Arab Spring really took off, where you saw, so many countries, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Tunisia, and more. You saw people come out on the streets, topple their governments, and try to form new ones. But in basically every case, it didn't work out so well. So we very well might see another version of that. There are already people protesting. You also have such a violent regime of warfare going on all over the place. Iran just bombed Saudi Arabia in September, and this was before all this went down. You have the Syrian civil war, which, while it's wound down, you have tons of fighters who have left the area, a population that is devastated but also inured to violence. Violence is normal to them, and violence is normal to a lot of people in this region. So it's much less of a leap for them to pick up a gun and fight against their government than it would be for, say, a French or an American citizen to do so. You have multilateral foreign intervention. So not only is it just America now just poking at people, but it's Russia, it's Turkey, it's China, it's all sorts of nations coming in to try to gain advantage, in addition to Middle Eastern countries themselves, like Turkey, like Iran, who are, like Saudi Arabia, for that matter, who are trying to influence what happens in countries. And the history of the Middle East is one of mostly empires. This idea of nation states is a very new one and a very flawed one. Britain and France drew these borders so that, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, but they drew these borders so that you had a large minority population that could be protected and invested in by an imperial power. So you have the drawing of Iraq, for example, has, say, 30% of the population is going to be, I always get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's 30% Sunni, 60% Shia, 10% Kurd, and that's incredibly, blurry, right? It's going to fluctuate, but basically what they do is the 30% minority, Britain gives them money, they give them guns, they give them university education, they give them all the places in the government. And then that minority says, okay, well, we love our spot at the top, so we're going to defend British interests, right? But now in 2020, after imperialism, you have these top-heavy minorities that have oppressed the majority population for so long, which is one of the biggest reasons, if not the single biggest reason, that America going into Iraq and starting a democracy doesn't work, because you have a population that is now in the majority, 60% of the population, it belongs to an ethnic group that has been oppressed for decades. So they hate the Sunnis. And so the Sunnis are like, well, crap, the majority of the population hates us because we've been living large for the past, century. So, but the government's not going to defend our interests, right? Because we're in the minority, and we now are no longer in the government. So who's going to defend us? Well, then ISIS shows up and defends Sunni aims. So that's where they flee to, is insurgents. So then then you have just the classic problem of the Middle East that we've seen for a century. Compounding all that is the demographic problem, where you have huge numbers of unemployed people who don't have anything to do, maybe besides playing video games. They're dependent on the state for money. In Saudi Arabia, maybe that works, but it's not going to work forever, especially now. And in Lebanon, it definitely doesn't work because the government's not rich. And compounding that, you have the educated classes who went to college. They learned about other nations and how other nations work. They learn about economics or history, and they understand how things can change. And then they see themselves having zero economic opportunities, where they are incredibly resentful about the situation they're in. They want things to change, and they know how to change, or they know how things might change. And the educated classes can often be the most dangerous ones in revolutionary times, because they're the ones who will, like Lenin, spearhead a movement, who know how to plan or strategize about how to go from large-scale unemployment and an autocratic regime to large-scale unemployment, pushing people onto the streets, to toppling the regime, to setting up a new government, right? That often requires a university education. And then underlying all of this is the fact that our population generally around the world is massive, right? In 1900, the world population was like 1.5 billion. It's now 7.5 billion. So that is 5 times larger. The Middle East is absolutely victim to this. They have a huge population of young people. Their population continues to grow. Egypt has, I think, 80 million people, Saudi Arabia, 30 million people. So you have a swelling population. It's only getting bigger. They are importing almost all their food. And climate change is going to make any food production that's already there soon untenable. So they're going to have to import more food. It's also the case that climate change is going to make the very atmosphere in the Middle East unlivable pretty soon. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of climate change, but within a few decades, being outside in the summer months in the Middle East, which is already unpleasant and terrible, it's going to become deadly if it isn't already deadly. We've seen temperatures like, I think, 140 degrees in Pakistan in recent years, and this is only going to increase. So you have this large population that's disaffected. They are unhappy with the situation, a plummeting ability for governments to pay for their population or to pay for basic government functions, and an environment that is increasingly destructive of the aims of society. So I'm very, very nervous about what's going to happen with this region that has already seen so much hardship and conflict over the past century. It doesn't look to be getting any better. So I'm very, very concerned. Thanks.